Before I get into sort of specs and things, the main thing that you should think about 10.5 is that compared to other chips, it's a little bit more open-ended by design. There's more than one right answer to many of the parts. It's not auto-graded in the same way that other chips are, which is both good and bad. There's not necessarily, the sort of pickiness of making sure that a spec, is handling the exact right query parameters or something like that, which is good, but it also means that you have to do a little bit more sort of thinking at places. The idea of this app, very briefly, is that if you're trying to do things, like let's say you're interested around organizing political events, you might tie news stories, campaign finance information to elected representatives. So there's a map, and I'm using a version of the solutions that isn't fully built out, but has some stuff. Your job will be to sort of make that map work in the first iteration. But basically it's a database of representatives, states, things like that. And your goal is to add features that would make this sort of more useful if you're tracking things. So, there's a search field here, and I forget what works at the beginning. But if I search for San Francisco, you should see, right, that the model finds all the people that potentially represent the city of San Francisco, through state employees or to mayors and things like that. And obviously, in this case, it doesn't make sense for you to have all of that stuff populated in the database. So the goal is to use APIs to provide that information. And what we want you to do is think about how do you interact with external services? How do you build an app that is not just dependent sort of on your own kind of information? And so much of that is scaffolded in there. When you click on a representative, you will be able to do things like potentially update and edit news articles. And so some of this will be there at the beginning. Your task will then be to do things like, let's say, this is a part of iteration, not this one. In iteration 2, there's a story such as tracking a specific set of issues that get attached to a news article that gets added. And so one of your goals will be to, say, add a form field, we give you the list of values, and then you go ahead and add things like RSpec tests, cucumber steps that ensure that those things are present. And so that's really the goal of this application, from the working perspective. How you divide up the work in teams, how you go through each iteration is up to you. A couple things that I'll point out that are just useful to be aware of. The app works with both Google and GitHub single sign-on. I forget exactly if we make you set up one or both of them, but like a good app in development, they work offline. They set up some test information. So some of these things you don't need to do automatically, but it's worth looking through and seeing how they work. The other thing that I'll briefly mention just about the code of the app, up until this point, everything that we've given you has been using the ERB syntax, which is embedded Ruby. It is HTML with a little bit of augmentation for dropping Ruby in there. In this app, there is a different syntax for the view files called HAML, which is a shorthand for HTML markup. What's nice about it is if you look at this, it should be pretty readable. So if we just zoom in here, right, this thing uses some dots are just classes that mean divs. Percentages are elements. There's links in there to describe, HAML and how it works. And then equal signs are Ruby code like they would be in ERB. But essentially, HAML is just sort of shorthand markup. A lot of the view code is provided to you. I forget what page this is. This is a news item show page. It is a little bit different, but hopefully when you go through, just take a few moments to read through, update it. Because there is no auto grader, if you would like to, you can, when you work on your features, you can tweak the colors of the buttons. It's not part of your grade, but it's something that if you find that parts of the UI, like adding a new story, are maybe misaligned, you're welcome to practice improving them. The other thing that I'll mention, so we haven't released iteration 2 yet. We're going to clean up the docs. But at the end of each iteration, we're giving you guidelines about what needs to be submitted. The goal here is less about specific, fully correct features and much more about the process. That doesn't mean you can turn in sloppy code. We're going to be looking at your pull requests. We're going to be looking at making sure that you have working CI, that when you merge in a pull request, that those check marks on GitHub should be green. But what we're trying to guide you towards is thinking about writing test coverage, improving the state of the app, and following the workflow. Much of the work is not just writing the code, but really going through and reading the specs. A couple people, have throughout the course, said I feel like I'm spending a lot of time and not writing much code. There's not a ton of code to write. Having the pieces work together is the point. So throughout this, at the end, you'll be doing things like submitting a retrospective document. Not a ton of writing, but at the end of each iteration, there's going to be 2 of them. Spend time with your team, talk about how it went. At the end of iteration 2, you're not going to necessarily do iteration 3, right? But if you were, talk about what you might do differently, how you would improve. And then we're using a tool called Teammates that you'll get emails from. You can log into that will be individual and team feedback surveys that help sort of gather the feedback on your peers. When we do the grading, probably next week or the final week, we'll release sort of the full rubric about how we break things down, but it's a factor of your individual work, your teammates' scores. You can't do well if all of your teammates say you do poorly. Similarly, just one person on your team cannot tank your entire grade. If one person doesn't like you, we will take that into account. We need a pattern of evidence, before we sort of adjust scores and so on. Our goal is not necessarily to make anything based on any one metric. It turns out that over the sum of this project, there's a lot of many little pieces that go into it. But that's really sort of the point. And then also the thing I'll mention when we release iteration 2, we're going to make what's part 3 on this page, we're going to make optional just given the timelines. But iteration 2 starts out with everyone doing the same feature of adding an attribute to a news story. Then there are sort of 2 parts. One is working with the further, which one is this? The Google News API, and the other is the ProPublica API. The ProPublica API, for various reasons, we follow the horrible but convenient practice of putting an API key in the documentation for you. Please don't use it outside of this class. It's a pretty simple API. But basically, what we want to give you the option is, as a team, discuss which of the 2 features you think would be more interesting to build. They are, generally equivalent in difficulty. So there's not necessarily, one isn't more or less work than the other. I think the Google News one is broken into slightly 4 tasks instead of 3. That's just because one of them is smaller than the others. But the goal is to sort of give you an option to build something that is hopefully a little bit more interesting to you. So when you get to that, that's for you to decide as a team. There's no benefit to doing one or the other than what's interesting. And then finally, the one thing I'll mention on deadlines. So I think that post has gone out. If not, I'll double check and make sure it's out today. For deadlines for each iteration, we are happy to extend them like we normally do by you filling out the extensions form and giving your group as a whole more time. But please be mindful of 2 things. The iteration 2 deadline is going to be, the last day of December 1st, whatever it is, the last day of regular classes. We really can't extend extensions beyond the Friday of Dead Week, and you probably don't want to spend too much of your Dead Week not studying for finals and so on. So, you'll be able to get a whole week extension on iteration 2, but not much more than that. This technically also goes for other chips. Honestly, I think that if you're working as a team, if you're sitting down and pairing, you shouldn't need too much extra time. Many of these features that you're working on, they should be able to be done in a couple hours if you're sitting there, working through discussing things with folks. Otherwise, the final thing that I guess I'll mention is that, when you're reading these features, we're describing things like a route, a page. Think about what the description is giving you. Think about what it's asking you to do, and recognize that there is more than one way to do it. There's not a correct answer. The staff in office hours are not going to tell you, exactly what code you need to write or what methods you might need to update or add. There's certainly multiple ways that you can answer them. And from a UI perspective as well, as long as the functionality exists, then you've met sort of the goals of the feature. We're not interested necessarily in assessing, that your form fields look exactly a certain way. Obviously, it's good if you practice, nicely laying things out, but the big picture is really the goal of 10.5. So that's what I'd say is there. Your Codio boxes should be set up to get everything installed and running. You should be pushing to Heroku, as much as possible. Like other chips, that'll be sort of part of the deliverable at each iteration. But yeah, that's really a little bit about what 10.5 is.